Have you ever tried following directions and realized they made no sense once you were actually on the road? Perhaps a street was missing, a landmark gone, or a path led you in circles. Now imagine that frustration multiplied by days when all you had was an old travel map, a map drawn by hand, copied unevenly, and riddled with errors. For centuries, travelers trusted these fragile guides, yet they often caused more confusion than clarity. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we'll wander through the uncertain world of old travel maps, where every line carried both hope and danger. If you enjoy these calm journeys into forgotten corners of life, you may gently subscribe, so the next story reaches you as surely as the morning follows night. Maps today are printed with exact precision. Roads, rivers, and cities appear neatly, distances measured by tools that rarely make mistakes. But centuries ago, maps were far less reliable. Each was drawn by hand, copied from other copies, often by people who had never walked the lands themselves. A mountain might appear twice as large as it truly was, a river drawn crooked when it was straight, or an entire village missing altogether. Have you ever played a game of whispers where the story changes as it passes from one person to another? Old maps worked much the same way. Errors multiplied with every new copy. Travelers, weary from miles, relied on these imperfect sketches. They studied faded ink, squinted at smudged symbols, and tried to match drawings with the world around them. But the world was rarely so cooperative. A straight road might wind endlessly. A nearby town could take half a day to reach. Some maps even flipped directions, placing west where east should have been. A single mistake might cost not just hours but days. The problem grew worse because landscapes changed. Rivers shifted course after floods. Roads were abandoned or rerouted. Towns moved their markets or shrank to nothing, yet maps continued to mark them proudly. Have you ever looked for a shop you remembered, only to find it closed forever? For travelers centuries ago, that happened constantly, except it wasn't shops, but entire villages disappearing from their maps. Symbols varied, too. One mapmaker might draw hills as neat little mounds. Another used dots. Some maps used tiny houses to represent towns. But how many houses meant a village, and how many meant a city? Travelers argued, debated, and often guessed. Wrong guesses led them astray, sometimes into forests, sometimes into marshes, sometimes onto roads that dwindled into nothing. Distance was perhaps the greatest source of confusion. Without precise tools, mapmakers estimated by memory or by counting days of travel. But a day for one man on horseback was not the same as a day for a family with carts. Maps claimed towns were one day apart, but for whom? A quick rider? A slow merchant? Distances stretched or shrank depending on the reader, leaving travelers lost in the gap between expectation and reality. Yet maps were too valuable to ignore. Even flawed, they gave a sense of direction, a thread of order through the chaos of unknown roads. Travelers clutched them like talismans of certainty, even as they cursed their mistakes. Imagine standing at a fork in the road, one path leading east, the other south. Without a map, the choice is blind. With a map, at least there is the illusion of guidance, even if the guidance is wrong. Stories spread about maps gone wrong. Merchants spoke of detours that added days to their journeys. Messengers complained of chasing phantom towns. Some swore that certain maps were cursed, leading every traveler astray. But the truth was simpler. Human error, multiplied by time, made even the best maps unreliable. And yet, people still set out with them, tracing faded ink, whispering names of places they had never seen. Why? Because even a broken map gave hope. And hope was enough to carry weary feet forward, even when the road bent in unexpected ways. So why could old travel maps get you lost for days? Because they were not mirrors of reality, but shadows of it, drawn from memory, copied imperfectly, altered by time. They promised certainty, but gave only hints. And in the gap between promise and truth, travelers wandered, learned patience, and discovered that the road itself was always the final teacher. Have you ever returned to a place after many years and found it unrecognizable? A path blocked, a building gone, a new street where there once was none? For travelers centuries ago, this was not the exception, but the rule. Old maps might have marked the world as it once was, but the world refused to stay still. Roads shifted, towns declined, bridges collapsed, and nature reclaimed what people abandoned. And so, even when a map was drawn carefully, by the time a traveler used it, the land had already changed beneath their feet. Roads were the most treacherous of all. They wore down quickly, becoming rutted, muddy, or washed away. A sudden flood could erase a path entirely, leaving only scattered stones. Caravans avoided the ruined route, forging new trails nearby. Before long, the old road was forgotten, while the map continued to point to it faithfully. Have you ever followed directions to a street that no longer exists? That feeling of futility was multiplied when the road itself had melted into the earth. Seasons changed roads too. In summer, a track across dry ground seemed clear enough. In winter, snow buried it, forcing travelers to guess. Spring rains turned paths into bogs, while autumn leaves hid turns and crossings. A map that seemed reliable in one season could be useless in another. Travelers cursed the ink on parchment when their feet sank ankle-deep into mud where a safe road was marked. Bridges were another hazard. Built of wood or simple stone, they collapsed often. A map might show a neat crossing over a river, but when travelers arrived, they found nothing but water and broken beams. The choice was grim. Turn back, losing days, or attempt a dangerous ford. Both added time, both carried risk, and both reminded the traveler that maps aged poorly against the relentless hand of weather. Towns themselves shifted. Some grew smaller, their people moving elsewhere. A once busy market might shrink to a scattering of huts, its importance erased, but its name still glowing boldly on the map. Other towns disappeared entirely, swallowed by neglect or disaster. Travelers wandered, searching for roofs that no longer stood, for wells that had long gone dry. Have you ever gone looking for a place that only existed in memory? That was the bitter reality of many who trusted outdated maps. Conversely, new towns appeared. A fresh settlement sprung up along a trade route, might be bustling, yet absent from the parchment. Travelers stumbled upon these unexpected places with surprise, grateful for supplies, but confused when they could not find them on the page. Old maps ignored the new, celebrating ghosts while overlooking the living. Nature also reclaimed paths. Forests crept back, roots cracking stones, branches covering clearings. Marshes spread, swallowing roads that once carried carts. Hills shifted after storms, landslides burying familiar tracks. Maps were static, but the land was alive, changing constantly. Have you ever seen how quickly a neglected garden fills with weeds? Multiply that by years, and you can imagine what an abandoned road became. Merchants, soldiers, and messengers all told tales of these shifting landscapes. Some laughed at their misfortune, recalling nights spent circling valleys in search of a missing crossing. Others spoke bitterly, describing goods spoiled or deadlines missed because a road promised by the map led only to confusion. These stories spread like warnings, teaching travelers to trust their eyes more than ink. So why did roads change faster than maps? Because the world was never still. Water carved new streams. People abandoned old paths. Storms reshaped the land. Maps froze a moment in time, but travelers lived in the present. And in that gap between parchment and earth, many found themselves lost for days, walking circles while chasing ghosts of roads that no longer existed. Have you ever looked at a diagram or chart and struggled to understand what the shapes actually meant? For travelers centuries ago, maps were not written in a universal language of symbols. Instead, each mapmaker invented, borrowed, or copied their own signs, leaving travelers puzzled by drawings that could be interpreted in multiple ways. These symbols meant to guide, often misled instead, turning journeys into puzzles that cost precious time. Hills might be drawn as neat humps, a line of little half-circles scattered across the page. But did 3 humps mean 3 hills or 1 range? Was their size meant to show height or just importance? Travelers debated endlessly. Some maps drew mountains as jagged triangles, others as clusters of dots, still others as shaded patches. A traveler staring at the page had to guess which style their mapmaker preferred, and hope they guessed correctly. Rivers were equally tricky. A bold blue line might mark a wide river, but on another map a thin squiggle might mean the same thing. Forks and bends were rarely accurate. Some maps stretched rivers straight across, ignoring their meanders. Others exaggerated them, making small curves into great loops. A traveler expecting a crossing after 2 bends might walk for miles before finding the actual ford. Have you ever misread a bus map, mistaking a stop for a junction? The frustration was the same, except measured in days rather than minutes. Towns were perhaps the most confusing. Tiny houses scattered across parchment. Did they represent a village or a thriving city? Some maps added towers, others drew walls, but the drawings were often symbolic rather than realistic. One town drawn larger than another might not mean it was physically bigger. It might simply mean the mapmaker thought it was more important. Travelers were left guessing whether they would find bustling markets or only a cluster of cottages when they arrived. Roads themselves were often drawn as simple lines, but thickness varied, sometimes meaning a main route, sometimes drawn thick only because the copyist's pen slipped. Dashed lines, double lines, faint curves. No one agreed on standards. Travelers traced these uncertain marks, debating whether the faint path was real or an error. Many followed them only to discover the road led nowhere at all. Even the compass rose, that neat circle pointing north, was not always reliable. Some maps placed east at the top, others south, others whichever direction the maker found most useful. A traveler accustomed to one style could become hopelessly disoriented when handed a map drawn by another hand. Imagine opening a modern GPS app and finding north no longer at the top. Confusion would be immediate. For old travelers, it was a constant hazard. Colors, when used, added more confusion than clarity. Blue might mean rivers on one map, borders on another. Green could mark forests or simply fertile fields. Yellow could signal sand, or it might mean nothing at all, just decoration by the copyist. And when maps were copied by hand, colors often faded or smeared, erasing meaning entirely. Travelers shared tales of these symbol confusions. One merchant swore he spent 3 days searching for a mountain range that turned out to be nothing more than a cluster of hills. Another complained that a grand city drawn with towers was in reality a poor village of wooden huts. These stories became warnings passed along in taverns and markets, reminding others that maps were guides, not guarantees. So why were symbols so misleading? Because they lacked standard rules. Each map maker used what they knew. Each copyist changed details without realizing it, and travelers paid the price in wasted time. Symbols that should have given clarity instead became riddles, and solving those riddles often cost days of wandering. Have you ever copied something by hand and noticed that small errors creep in? A word skipped, a letter smudged, a line drawn slightly wrong? Now imagine that happening not once, but dozens of times across years, across countries. Old maps survived not by printing presses, but by human hands, copying and recopying until the same mistakes spread like ripples, and new mistakes appeared with each stroke of the pen. For travelers, this meant that the map they carried might be less a picture of the world and more a picture of someone else's errors. Copyists were rarely map makers themselves. They were scribes hired to duplicate documents for libraries, merchants, or noble households. Their goal was speed and legibility, not accuracy. If they misread a faded mark or skipped a crooked line, no one corrected them. A river might split where no split existed. A town might vanish if the copyist's eye wandered. Over time, these errors multiplied until a map became a puzzle of half-truths. Distances were especially vulnerable. A careless hand might stretch a road, making it look twice as long. A cramped space on parchment might compress 2 towns, so they seemed neighbors when they were half a day apart. Travelers trusted these marks, only to be betrayed when their journey dragged longer than expected. Have you ever trusted directions only to find a destination farther than promised? For them, that disappointment often came after exhausting miles. Names shifted with copying too. Letters blurred, ink faded, dialects differed. A town might begin as Westbrook, but after a dozen copies, appear as Westrick. Travelers, reading their maps, searched for a place that locals did not recognize, not realizing the name had simply morphed through scribes' pens. Entire journeys were delayed by these small changes, as strangers shook their heads at words that sounded familiar yet unplaceable. Borders and landmarks suffered the same fate. A mountain drawn slightly east in one copy became farther east in the next, until it drifted entirely away from its real position. Forests swelled or shrank with each new version, depending on how the copyist arranged space. Lakes might vanish entirely if the scribe mistook them for stains. Have you ever doodled while copying something and realized your version looks different? These map copies carried such distortions across generations. The greatest confusion came when maps from different sources clashed. A traveler might carry two, each claiming different truths. One said the river bent north, the other south. One showed a village near the crossroads, the other placed it miles away. Which to trust? Both were flawed, but in different ways. Many travelers ended up lost between them, trying to reconcile lines that never truly matched. Copyists also added their own touches. Some decorated maps with flourishes, trees, animals, little ships, not realizing their drawings might be mistaken for real information. Travelers sometimes followed a symbol of a tower, believing it marked a town, only to discover it was merely an embellishment. The difference between decoration and detail blurred dangerously. So why did copying make maps worse? Because every mistake once made lived on. Each new scribe carried it forward, and each added fresh errors of their own. Maps became less reflections of the land and more reflections of human imperfection. And those imperfections sent travelers wandering in circles, searching for roads and towns that had never truly existed. Have you ever tried following written directions only to realize the person who gave them left out important details? Old maps worked much the same way. They offered hints of the world, suggestions of where roads might go, but they rarely gave the step-by-step clarity that tired travelers needed. Instead, they raised questions. Does this line bend here or there? Does this symbol mean a bridge, a ford, or just a place where the road crosses water? For those on the road, these questions meant wasted hours, sometimes wasted days. Maps often showed the big picture, but left out the practical details. A traveler might see a road drawn neatly between two towns, only to discover it forked several times along the way. Which fork matched the map? No one could be sure. Travelers argued at crossroads, pointing at parchment, squinting at fading ink, each insisting the other had misread. Have you ever stood with someone over a map and disagreed about which turn to take? For them, such arguments could stretch late into the night. The issue was not only forks. Landmarks that maps relied on often changed or disappeared. A tree drawn as a marker might have been cut down years earlier. A well, once famous, might have dried up. A stone crossroad marker might have fallen, its pieces scattered by storms. The map still claimed they were there, but the world no longer agreed. Travelers stared at empty spaces, wondering if they were lost, or if the map was simply wrong. Distances confused them further. Maps rarely explained scale. Was 1 inch equal to 5 miles or 10? A road drawn short on parchment could stretch endlessly in reality. One merchant recalled walking half a day to reach a nearby village that the map suggested was just a short distance away. Another swore a long road, marked boldly on his chart, was nothing more than an hour's stroll. Without standard measures, every traveler had to guess, and often guessed wrong. Maps also struggled with detail in rough landscapes. Forests were often drawn as vague green patches, but how deep were they? How many miles would they take to cross? Marshes appeared as shaded smudges, but where were they safe to pass? The parchment gave no answers, leaving travelers to discover hazards the hard way. Have you ever been told it's just through the woods, only to find the path twisting endlessly? That frustration was the nightly reality of map-guided journeys. Even rivers were tricky. Some maps drew them straight, others crooked. Fords, bridges, or ferries were rarely marked clearly. A traveler expecting to cross easily might arrive at a wide, rushing current with no safe passage in sight. Their only choice was to backtrack, wasting precious hours. Tales of such detours filled markets, each told with exasperation and laughter at the stubborn faith people placed in ink. And yet, despite their flaws, maps remained treasured. They gave hope, even when wrong. The parchment felt like certainty, even if that certainty dissolved on the ground. Travelers clutched them because the alternative, walking blind, was worse. Maps may have confused them, but they still offered courage to face the road ahead. Even now, as you listen to this story, you can imagine those weary travelers standing at a fork, map unfurled in the wind, arguing over bent lines and faded names. And if you would like more of these calm wanderings into forgotten corners of life, you may gently subscribe, so the next story finds you as surely as the road eventually found them. So what was the trouble with directions on paper? That they gave only part of the truth, never the whole. They showed lines but not choices, symbols but not explanations. And in those gaps, days were lost, roads were retraced, and travelers learned that a map was only as trustworthy as the land itself allowed. Have you ever used a landmark to guide your way, only to realize later that it looked different than you remembered? For travelers centuries ago, landmarks were both lifelines and traps. Old maps depended heavily on them. Drawings of hills, rivers, towers, or great trees dotted the parchment. These signs promised to guide weary feet, yet they often deceived, shifting in appearance, vanishing over time or multiplying into confusion. A hill might be drawn boldly, as though it rose above the land like a beacon. Yet on the ground it was only one among dozens, indistinguishable without a guide. Travelers climbed one slope after another, comparing each to the faint line on the map, until exhaustion blurred their judgment. Have you ever thought this must be it, only to doubt yourself moments later? That was the nightly rhythm of those who searched for hills that never matched the ink. Trees posed similar challenges. Some maps marked single oaks or pines as reference points. But trees live and die. A storm might fell the very landmark a traveler was searching for. New growth might surround it, hiding its shape. Worse still, different map makers chose different trees. A great elm on one map was a tall pine on another, leaving travelers to argue over which shadow on the horizon was meant to guide them. Buildings offered more trouble than certainty. Mills, inns, or bridges were often drawn in miniature, but not every map maker agreed on which ones mattered. A mill marked proudly might have burned years earlier. An inn might have changed names, leaving no trace for the traveler to confirm. Bridges washed away or collapsed, while maps continued to mark them as if they still stood strong. For those following parchment, the world often seemed out of step with the promises of its symbols. Water confused travelers most of all. A lake shown as a neat oval might in reality stretch irregularly, with inlets and marshy edges that bore no resemblance to the drawing. Rivers meandered, split, or vanished into the ground, while maps straightened them into simple lines. Imagine expecting to cross at a gentle bend, only to find a tangle of currents. That shock was enough to delay entire journeys. Even the stars of maps, the towns themselves, could mislead. Some maps drew them proudly, towers sketched with flourish. But when travelers arrived, the town was little more than a handful of cottages, or worse, gone altogether. The parchment exaggerated, the ink lied, and the traveler paid in wasted days. Travelers learned not to trust any single landmark. They used combinations instead, matching 2 or 3 signs together before believing. A hill beside a river bend, with a village nearby. That pattern was safer than chasing one lonely tree. But even then, the land often refused to cooperate. Landscapes changed, maps did not, and travelers suffered the difference. Stories of misleading landmarks filled marketplaces. Merchants joked about searching for the eternal oak that had vanished generations earlier. Messengers groaned about bridges that existed only on parchment. Each tale reminded listeners that maps were guides, not guarantees. The land itself always had the final say. So why did landmarks lie? Because the world shifted, nature aged, and mapmakers exaggerated. A landmark was only reliable in the moment it was drawn, and every year after made it less certain. Travelers who forgot this learned the hard way, wandering circles, chasing ghosts, and losing days to ink that could never keep pace with the earth. Have you ever tried giving someone directions from memory and realized later that you forgot important turns? That was exactly how many old maps were made. Instead of precise surveys or measurements, they were drawn from memory, a traveler's recollection of roads taken, a merchant's impression of towns visited, a messenger's hurried notes scribbled after long journeys. And memory, as we all know, is both useful and unreliable. A merchant might recall a road bending gently through fields, yet in truth it twisted sharply into hills. A soldier might remember a river as narrow, forgetting that it widened in spring. Each memory was shaped by the experience of the person recalling it, their speed, their attention, their fatigue. Have you ever noticed how 2 people can describe the same place differently? That difference, multiplied across many hands, filled maps with contradictions. Distances were especially vulnerable to memory's tricks. A short ride on horseback felt quick, but for a man walking with a loaded pack, the same road felt endless. Mapmakers often drew distances based on their own sense of time, not actual measurement. This meant that a short day's walk for one might take another 2 or 3. Travelers who trusted such notes often found themselves lost not because of direction, but because of exhaustion. Even the placement of towns suffered from memory's flaws. Some mapmakers placed important towns larger and closer than they truly were, shrinking smaller villages into near invisibility. Others forgot minor settlements altogether, leaving travelers puzzled when they stumbled upon communities absent from their charts. Have you ever looked at a map app that ignored smaller streets, leaving you stranded? Imagine that, but with whole villages missing. Nature blurred in memory as well. Hills merged together, rivers straightened, forests became patches rather than tangled expanses. A man recalling his rut weeks later simplified everything, turning complex landscapes into clean lines. Maps became less portraits of the world and more impressions, like sketches drawn quickly, useful but incomplete. Travelers sometimes noticed when memory betrayed the mapmaker. A map might claim a river was 2 bends from the road, yet when they arrived, the river bent 5 or 6 times before crossing. Another might mark a bridge that no longer existed, drawn simply because the mapmaker remembered it from years earlier. Memory fossilized on parchment, freezing mistakes alongside truths. Stories spread of the worst maps, one so clearly drawn from faulty memory that they became jokes. Merchants mocked charts that placed towns impossibly close, or drew mountains where none existed. Some called them dream maps, claiming they looked more like fantasies than guides. Yet even these flawed documents were kept, copied, and sold, because they were still better than nothing. So why did memory dominate map-making? Because precision was scarce. Few people had tools to measure distances or chart landscapes carefully. Travelers relied on what they saw and remembered, turning fleeting impressions into lasting lines. The world on paper became the world of human recollection, and memory's imperfections echoed across every road. In the end, maps were not so much mirrors of the land as they were mirrors of the mind. They showed not the world as it was, but the world as someone thought it was. And when travelers trusted those memories too much, they often found themselves wandering, chasing recollections that had long since faded from truth. Have you ever compared two guides or instructions, only to find they completely contradicted each other? That was the challenge many travelers faced when they carried more than one map. Instead of confirming truth, the maps fought with each other, leaving travelers to choose between competing versions of the world. In this clash of ink and parchment, entire journeys could be delayed, and trust in maps weakened further. A merchant might own a map bought in one city and borrow another from a companion. One showed a river bending north. The other claimed it bent south. One promised a town at a crossroads. The other marked nothing at all. Which should they believe? Travelers debated endlessly, pointing at curves, comparing names, arguing late into the night. Have you ever asked two friends for directions and received answers so different that both seemed wrong? That confusion grew heavier when the road stretched on for miles. The problem arose because mapmakers worked in isolation. Each drew from memory, from stories, or from earlier maps. Their versions of reality were shaped by where they lived and what they thought mattered most. A city near their home might appear grand and central, while distant lands shrank into vague smudges. Another mapmaker in a different region reversed the emphasis, exaggerating their own familiar places. Travelers caught between these maps found themselves wandering the middle ground, uncertain of which version to follow. Names worsened the confusion. A town might be called by one name in one region, another name in the next. One map recorded the first, another the second. A traveler searching for Brookfield might find locals only knew Riverton, though both meant the same place. Maps disagreed not because of distance, but because of language. The traveler, lost in translation, wasted days searching for clarity. Even distances clashed. One map maker might stretch the space between towns, another compress it. Travelers timed their steps, counting hours, waiting for landmarks to appear, only to be disappointed. Some walked twice as far as expected. Others reached destinations much sooner than the map suggested, throwing off their sense of progress. Have you ever been told it's just down the road only to find it far away? Multiply that by whole days, and you feel the frustration of those journeys. Worse still, some maps copied each other's mistakes, creating a false sense of agreement. Two maps might both show a non-existent bridge, or both exaggerate the size of a hill. Travelers felt confident when both sources agreed, only to be betrayed when reality proved otherwise. The comfort of double evidence turned to double disappointment. Travelers adapted by using maps less as strict guides and more as rough suggestions. They compared them with what their eyes saw, weighing the land against the ink. Some chose to trust locals over parchment, asking villagers about routes instead of following crooked lines. Others carried multiple maps, using them together, hoping truth lay somewhere in between. Yet even this method failed often, leaving confusion unresolved. Tales of map disagreement spread widely. Merchants mocked the absurdities, saying 2 maps will send you 2 ways. 3 will keep you circling forever. Messengers cursed when deadlines were missed because their guides contradicted each other. For them, maps were not companions, but obstacles, turning every journey into a test of judgment. So why did maps disagree so often? Because they were not products of shared knowledge, but fragments of individual memory and bias. Each map told a different story, and none told the full truth. And in the space between those stories, travelers lost days wandering through landscapes that cared little for the ink that claimed to capture them. Have you ever placed too much trust in something, only to realize later it didn't deserve it? Old travel maps often failed not because they were unreadable, but because people believed them too much. A line of ink on parchment carried enormous weight, convincing travelers to follow routes that common sense warned against. This misplaced trust could cost hours, days, and sometimes even safety itself. Maps, once unfolded, seemed authoritative. The lines looked deliberate, the symbols intentional. Travelers told themselves, if it is written here, it must be true. A bridge marked in ink meant they expected a crossing. A town drawn boldly meant supplies should be waiting. Roads sketched firmly seemed safer than faint ones. The map gave an illusion of certainty, and weary travelers clung to that illusion tightly. But illusions are fragile. Travelers walked confidently into marshes where no firm ground existed. They chased rivers that bent differently than promised. They marched toward towns that were either far smaller than expected or gone entirely. Each step taken in blind faith deepened the mistake, pulling them further from where they needed to be. Have you ever followed directions stubbornly, even when the road itself seemed wrong? Imagine doing so with days of travel at stake. The danger was greatest for those unfamiliar with the land. Locals often shook their heads at maps, trusting memory and oral directions instead. But outsiders had no choice. A merchant far from home, a messenger rushing across new territories, pilgrim on an unfamiliar route, all leaned heavily on their maps. Their trust turned parchment into both guide and trap. Confidence often silenced doubt. Groups argued less when the map seemed clear. It is written here, one would say, and the others, too tired to resist, would follow. They ignored signs of error, a road narrowing too quickly, a hill rising where none should be, until the mistake was undeniable. By then, hours had already been lost. Trust also bred dependency. Some travelers stopped watching the land, relying solely on their maps. They missed obvious signs, fresh tracks leading elsewhere, locals pointing out alternate routes, paths clearly marked by stone piles or posts. Eyes locked on parchment blinded them to the very clues that might have saved them. Stories of this blind trust filled markets and inns. One tale told of a merchant who insisted on following his map straight into a swamp, refusing to turn until his cart wheels sank. Another of a messenger who delayed delivery by 2 full days because he trusted a short cut drawn boldly, but which twisted endlessly through hills. These stories were repeated half in laughter, half in warning. Even now, as you listen to this history, you can sense that quiet danger, the temptation to trust what is written over what is seen. And if you enjoy wandering into these forgotten lessons of the past, you may gently subscribe, so each new story arrives to guide you better than the maps once did. So why did trust become the greatest risk? Because it gave maps more authority than they deserved. Parchment could not change with the land, could not correct itself, could not admit its flaws. Travelers who trusted too much paid dearly, not because the map was malicious, but because it was never truly capable of capturing the living, changing world. Have you ever found yourself lost, only to later realize that being lost taught you more than finding the right path ever could? For travelers centuries ago, the greatest lesson of old maps was not how to follow them, but how to survive when they failed. The parchment promised direction, but the road itself became the true teacher. When maps led them astray, travelers learned to read the land. They noticed how rivers carved valleys, how ridges pointed toward towns, how roads tended to follow natural curves. A stream flowing steadily often hinted at a village downstream. A worn path, even faint, suggested others had walked it recently. These signs, overlooked when the map seemed trustworthy, became vital when ink betrayed them. Companions also became guides. Groups debated, argued, and eventually pooled their instincts. One noticed a cart rot in the dirt. Another recognized a smell of smoke on the wind. Another spotted fields on a distant slope. Together, they pieced clues into direction. Have you ever solved a problem with friends, each offering one piece of the puzzle? That was how travelers navigated when maps failed, through shared judgment, not paper certainty. Locals, too, became lifelines. Asking directions might feel humbling, but it often saved days. Villagers laughed gently at outsiders clutching maps, then pointed towards safer crossings, shorter paths, or hidden shortcuts. Their knowledge came not from ink, but from lived experience, and it outshone any parchment, however carefully drawn. The lessons of failure built resilience. Travelers discovered patience, the ability to accept delays without despair. They discovered humility, the wisdom to admit that parchment was not always right. And they discovered adaptability, the skill to change course, to improvise, to survive despite confusion. Each wrong turn hardened them for the next, making them stronger for journeys yet to come. Morning light often softened the sting of mistakes. A road that seemed hopelessly confusing at night revealed its true course at dawn. A fork that had split the group's trust became obvious when fields stretched in one direction and woods in the other. The land forgave in daylight, reminding them that while maps failed, the world itself remained constant, waiting to be read by open eyes. So what did travelers truly learn from old maps that misled them? That certainty is an illusion, that no ink can capture a living, shifting world. That human memory, however careful, fades and twists. And yet, despite every wrong road, every wasted day, every detour, they learned that survival depended not on parchment, but on perseverance. By the time the journey ended, maps were folded away, smudged and creased, half resented and half treasured. They had been both companion and betrayer, both guide and obstacle. And perhaps that was their truest role, not to deliver travelers safely every time, but to remind them that safety on the road could never be guaranteed. This history closes where the maps always ended, with travelers walking on, uncertain yet determined, guided less by faded ink and more by the resilience they carried within. And though the maps often got them lost for days, those days shaped them, turning confusion into wisdom and leaving stories that still echo quietly long after the parchment is crumbled to dust.